Oh, are you serious?
I never kid about money.
In 1986, Tom Cruise was on top of the world. Top Gun had come out and become the biggest movie of the year, minting him as a bona fide superstar. However, Cruise had bigger ambitions beyond being an action hero or heartthrob. He wanted to be a legitimate, respected actor, so before Top Gun ever hit theaters, he had already wrapped a role where he'd play opposite one of the biggest movie stars of all time, Paul Newman, whose career Cruise would likely want to emulate, as the older actor was able to find the perfect balance between art and commerce, while never sacrificing his brand as a star. Their movie together, The Color of Money, would go on to be a highlight of both filmographies and notably gritty entry that paired both for the only time with the great Martin Scorsese. Flashback to 1961. Paul Newman was one of the biggest movie stars in the world, but his acting talent was never given its proper due. He was a heartthrob, but the great performances he'd become known for were in his future. Remember, at this point he hadn't made HUD or Cool Hand Luke or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid or any of those movies. His most acclaimed performance up to this point had been in the watered-down Tennessee Williams adaptation Cat in a Hot Tin Roof, although everyone mostly remembers Elizabeth Taylor slinking around in that one rather than Paul Newman. To many, he lacked depth as an actor, which was explored in the recent Ethan Hawke documentary The Last Movie Stars. He was handsome, but was he a great actor? Any doubts would be put aside once audiences got a load of him as Fast Eddie Felson in Robert Rosen's The Hustler. In it, he'd play a pool hall hustler whose ambitions and pride get him into serious trouble, culminating in an intergenerational showdown with the great pool shark Minnesota Fats, played by the great one himself, Jackie Gleason. In the end, Felson is the victor, but he's warned by the criminal element that his hustling days are over, or else. It's a down and dirty movie for 1961, with Newman not always sympathetic as the impulsive, often cruel Fast Eddie. It was based on a novel by Walter Tevis, who also wrote The Queen's Gambit, and over 2 decades later would revisit the character in his novel The Color of Money. The notion of revisiting his most famous character must have appealed to Paul Newman at the time, who was riding a renewed wave of popularity in the wake of delivering perhaps his finest performance ever in Sidney Lumet's The Verdict. It was the first time Newman seemed to really embrace middle age, and indeed, he looked a whole lot different in the mid-80s than he did in the early 60s. The notion of revisiting Fast Eddie in his middle age led to Newman pursuing Martin Scorsese as a director, with the star having been very impressed by Raging Bull. To note, Scorsese's career was at a low ebb in 1986. While Raging Bull won some Oscars, it hadn't made any money, and the me decade in Hollywood was all about generating cash and being commercially viable. Suffice to say, Scorsese just didn't really fit in. He wasn't Steven Spielberg or George Lucas. He wasn't making those kinds of movies. The King of Comedy was another critical hit that didn't make a dime, and his follow-up After Hours was also a huge flop. Scorsese had ambitions to make large-scale movies like The Last Temptation of Christ, but they were not commercial. To do so, he had to prove to the studios that not only could he stay on schedule and on budget, but he could also deliver a solid hit film as a hired gun. However, even if The Color of Money wouldn't necessarily be a passion project for Scorsese, the director was bent on making it as good as he possibly could, which led to him ditching the Walter Tevis novel in favor of an original screenplay by the great Richard Price. In this new film, we'd meet Fast Eddie deep into middle age. He hasn't touched a pool cue in years, with him instead peddling knockoff brands of whiskey to bars, which sounds like a big come down were it not for the fact that Fast Eddie's so charming, he's made an extremely comfortable living at his job. He seems to have a solid life worked out for himself, even romancing a pretty bartender played by Helen Shaver that's notably younger than he is. One day, he spies a young pool player with a shotgun break. That player is Tom Cruise's Vince, who's got the raw talent Fast Eddie used to have. In it, he spies the opportunity to make some serious cash, exploiting Vince the same way he was once exploited in The Hustler. To his surprise, though, their con games reawaken his love of the game, leading to Fast Eddie once again picking up the pool cue, only to realize he's no longer quite so fast and that Vince is a lot less naive than he seems. What makes The Color of Money especially interesting is the way filmmaking changed in the 25-year interval between The Hustler and The Color of Money. Recently, Tom Cruise had a huge hit with his legacy sequel Top Gun Maverick, and it was made at an even longer interval, but Top Gun and Top Gun Maverick feel closer in age than The Hustler and The Color of Money. So much had changed with the form, and Newman, to his credit, gave Scorsese free rein to make it a true Martin Scorsese movie, which gives the film an honest contemporary vibe. The world of pool hustling has changed, with pool halls no longer controlled by the mob. They have bigger fish to fry in the 80s. Makes the world a lot less dangerous from a physical standpoint. Fast Eddie is annoyed by a lot of the new things in this world, particularly the way wannabes like John Turturro's character dabble with cocaine, with even Eddie at one point saying how different the vibe is from the 60s when the big vice was booze. Scorsese's choice of music is great in this, with him working with his usual music supervisor, Robbie Robertson of the band, for a rock soundtrack that lends itself to some signature moments, including Vince demolishing competitors to Warren Zevon's Werewolf of London. This brings me to the Tom Cruise of it all. When Color of Money was cast, Tom Cruise hadn't come out, so people didn't really know how to peg him. Would Cruise be a flash-in-the-pan hearthrob like a Christopher Atkins from The Blue Lagoon, or was he as legit as someone like Sean Penn? Scorsese took a risk on him that paid off, with the movie becoming a pretty sizable hit thanks to Cruise's wave of megastardom following Top Gun. Cruise is great as Vince, with him evoking a great transition from being a smart-mouthed, sheltered kid to a protege that learns how to pull one over on his mentor. He's kind of the movie's villain rather than its hero, but it never judges him too harshly. For most of the movie, he's being used, not only by Eddie, but also by his trophy girlfriend, played by Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, who reveals to Fast Eddie that she was once a thief who helped burgle Vince's upper-middle-class home before warming her way into his life. Vince starts off as a headstrong teen, but eventually becomes a slick player, very much in the Tom Cruise movie star mode. It would be really interesting to see a legacy sequel to the movie get made, with Scorsese, of course, directing, where Vince is now the older player mentoring someone younger. I wonder if Cruise can still play pool the way he used to in the 80s, with him having famously pulled off most of the trick shots featured in the film. In the end, The Color of Money wound up being a pretty major hit, grossing $52 million, a pretty decent number for 1986. That was only about a third of what Top Gun made, but all involved were likely very happy. It would help Scorsese get the funding he needed for Last Temptation of Christ, while it would also pave the way for Cruise to expand as a dramatic actor in Rain Man and Born on the 4th of July. Of everyone, though, the one who got the most out of this movie was Paul Newman, and really it is his film. I mean, there are so many great sequences involving Paul Newman in this, particularly the one where he gets completely hustled by Forrest Whitaker, of all people, in a very early role, as this kind of shuffling pool player who everybody really underestimates but cleans Fast Eddie's clock, and man, the two of them together are electric. Forrest Whitaker walked out of this movie kind of a star, which is funny because nobody had really heard of him before this. It's one of those great one-scene roles, and he's terrific. Newman is just fantastic in this movie, and his shame at having been hustled is so palpable, but also you really root for him once he decides to stop screwing around and, become a legit pool player again. It was the movie that famously won Paul Newman the elusive Best Actor trophy at the Academy Awards, despite him infamously losing so many times in the past, with him losing for Cat in the Hot Tin Roof, The Hustler, HUD, Cool Hand Luke, Absence of Malice, and most inexplicably of all, The Verdict. Newman was so sure that he'd lose he didn't even attend the ceremony. He would always be grateful to Scorsese, mentioning that the best piece of acting advice he ever got came from him when Scorsese told him to stop trying to be funny. This admiration went two ways, with Scorsese producing and appearing in Ethan Hawke's recent The Last Movie Stars. Cruise wouldn't work with Scorsese again, given how different the genres they typically work in are, but never say never. Come on guys, give us a sequel.